Welcome to B2B Sales Trends, the podcast dedicated to sales leaders in the B2B space, where we share conversations about innovative and successful sales transformations to keep you up to date on the latest trends. This podcast is brought to you by Global Performance Group.
Welcome yet to another fabulous episode, my dear people, of the B2B Sales Trends podcast, the show that brings you hacks, tips, thought leadership for sales, marketing, and customer success. It's brought to you by Global Performance Group. We are a revenue improvement boutique that implements behavior change to provide the skills, competence, confidence, and courage for salespeople and customer-facing people to sell and negotiate based on, should I rather say, on customer outcomes. We solve three problems for our clients, which is we're increasing their win rates, we're reducing sales cycles, and we're protecting their margins. My name is Kendlbacher, and today I have with me Aditya Malik. Aditya is the VP of Sales Strategy and Operations at HighRadius. Welcome to the B2B Sales Trends podcast, Aditya.
Thank you, Harry. It was so nice of you to invite me. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking with you. And I hope to learn from you as much.
Well, our listeners are always keen to tap into people's expertise. As a way to start this off, could you introduce yourself to the audience, a little bit about your background and your focus on your current role right now?
Sure, Harry. So I started, as a quick background, I started my professional journey back in 2005 with Unilever in their sales and marketing team. I spent a decade after that with Accenture Management Consulting, largely focused on sales and marketing problems and growth strategy problems. I had a couple of more stints after that, including with Strategy and in a general management consulting role. Again, largely focused on growth initiatives and digital transformations. For the last 2 years, I'm with HighRadius, which, as you might know, is a software firm in the finance automation space. So my current responsibilities right now really focus on building the sales and marketing playbooks for HighRadius. We have a team of around 600 sellers and account-based marketing executives. So really defining the playbook for these functions, innovating on it, ensuring people are trained up to execute as well as measuring their execution.
Right, fabulous. We've talked a couple of weeks ago a little bit about some of the challenges that salespeople and firms are facing. And I remember succinctly, we've talked about this idea of salespeople keep falling into a commodity trap. Share some sort of key insights, and also, what are some of the red flags that you have seen in your experience with Unilever, Accenture, and now with HighRadius? What are sort of the key indicators or the red flags that signals that a firm is falling into a commodity trap? And also, how can salespeople recognize and address that and get out of that commodity trap during their conversations?
So before I try to point to sort of the red flags that I've observed, let's just quickly center on what I meant, right, by talking about a commodity trap.
Right.
My observation, and this may be especially true of the software domain, is that it's very easy to claim feature functionality on parity with any competition in software. Adding a feature, at least on the face of it, is really quick, and it's easy to copy what others are claiming, right? What is much more difficult is to actually create performance and value, because that requires deep engineering and really thoughtful product building. So the commodity trap I refer to is when salespeople focus on feature functionality, right? And they're not able to really connect the feature functionality to value, right? That the product generates well, and convincingly establish it using demos or other tactics like that. So that's a very real challenge for a market leader like my firm, because everyone's trying to copy every feature that we talk about. So coming back to your original question around red flags, I think obviously a clear red flag is when you're looking in the rear view mirror and you start seeing pricing by competitors coming in as reasons for losses. Because what we've observed is competitors might price at 50% of our price or even lower. But if we do a good job of selling to value, then that's really not a problem when you have truly differentiated capabilities. So I think the loss to pricing is kind of the easy red flag to spot. The second one for us is probably when we see deals getting elongated in the middle stages or going back a couple of stages, right? And typically this is a symptom of mistakes made during discovery or during the functional evaluation of the product, where we've not really been able to identify the business pain and the KPIs that a prospect is targeting, and we haven't really tailored the solution and the demos accordingly. And that really leads to rethinking the decision and kind of slowing the deal down. I think those are probably the two most important red flags. Of course, a very leading indicator is simply assessing our salespeople's ability to connect feature functionality to value, right? And how well they're able to do that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The ultimate outcome, or the downfall, shall I say, of this activity that you have described is really a lower win rate that's as a result in that, right? And that idea that deals then halfway through the sales cycle basically get stuck if you don't get your salespeople to engage with prospects and all clients early on in the right way and let them be drawn into that commodity trap discussion, if you will. Absolutely, I completely agree with you. You said selling to value earlier a few minutes ago, and that's key. Now, I was in Las Vegas last week on a Sales 3.0 conference from Selling Power Magazine. It was very good.
Lucky you.
Lots of good speakers. One of them was myself, but anyway. So this idea of selling value is obviously still important. Now, what I've noticed from many of the speakers that I've listened to and observed is that their definition of that term, varies, is a little bit different. What is your ideal definition of selling to value? And also, what are the things that your salespeople or client-facing people need to be doing in order to do that really well? And let's keep that as simple as possible, because these things tend to be over-engineered selling value, right? Let's keep that as simple as possible. So what is your definition of selling value? And what do salespeople, in your opinion, need to do in order to do that really well?
Sure. I mean, it is a really simple definition at the heart of it, right? It kind of varies depending on the client, prospect's mindset. But let me start with the most simple form, right? Value is essentially solving a business problem that the prospect cares about. That's it, right? Now, it could mean staff, cost. It could mean compliance. It could mean a variety of things for the prospect. But at the end of the day, if you're removing their pain, if you're helping them succeed, if you're helping them look better at the end of the year, as an individual as well as a function, that's really value for them. And that's what you must anchor on. And you must have a sufficiently flexible framework for capturing and addressing the value so that you're not stuck on just your definition, right? Which we can fall into that trap of saying, hey, the value I provide is exactly this metric. As to what's the first step of doing it, it's essentially asking a simple question. What's the problem you're trying to solve? And what's really important for you to solve, right? This quarter, this year. Now, after saying that, I will caveat, there is a class of customers who will engage on this very well. And there is a class of prospects, rather, who are still educating themselves, right? They probably have not realized the pain or opportunity lying in their function very well. They have a sense it's there, but they haven't captured it well. So the
Right.
engagement with them might vary a little bit. You might need to kind of generate some interest in them, excite them about what's the art of the possible, and then start thinking about the business problem. They'll solve, but the business problems are there. And if they're not there, they're not going to buy.
Right. What is the problem and how big is it for you and how much pain does it cause you? Right.
Yep.
The idea of we always talk in our business, we always talk about the necessity for salespeople to really have that urgency conversation, right?
Mhm.
Because everybody nowadays, most businesses need to increase their win rates. And one way of doing that is the salespeople to have the conversation that create urgency, right? Because one of the biggest competitors that organizations have is not another competitor, is no
Yeah.
decision, right?
That's the number one. That's absolutely the number one. Yeah.
Why should I change? Change is difficult. Change is painful. And so my necessity to do something different has to be strong, urgent enough, and important enough for me to do something. So to make a decision on that. So that idea of how do we create urgency, and that includes things like, how do you have the cost of inaction conversation, for example? What is it going to cost you, my dear client, if you don't take action on this on a quarterly basis? Again, that creates that what you have referred to. What is the problem? How big is it? And how painful is it for me, right? Does that resonate with you?
Oh, it absolutely resonates. I think creating or gauging the urgency is extremely important to have high win rates. It applies at both places, by the way. I think you also need to filter on it, right? There are customers who are simply not in a decision-making mindset. Nothing's a burning problem. They can specify some pain points, but they're abstract for them. And those customers are much tougher sell. But what you said absolutely resonates. I would add a dimension to this as well, in that it's important to understand what the executives and the economic buyers will really respond to. And sometimes the level of maturity there is very different from the managers or department heads that you may start conversations with. But yes, cutting across both, I do have some reservations about the ability to make a case for the cost of inaction. Typically, I think that's like a soft benefit comparison that's hard to conclusively put out there. But yeah, I mean, in some cases it can work to spur people to action. I think we see much more success when we do align ourselves to the pain points or objectives that the execs are already trying to achieve, and kind of fit the solution around them. That drives kind of intrinsic urgency, and then addressing it at the top also makes sure the people below them are also acting fast on it, as opposed to taking their own time before making up their mind.
Right, absolutely. Interesting point. I always say, people never race to the pharmacy to buy vitamins, but they're racing to the pharmacy to buy painkillers when they're in pain, right? So let's have the conversation around that. Let's go back to a little bit that value piece that you've mentioned. I'm curious at that, and especially in the context of software sales.
Yeah,
it would be interesting your opinion. How important do you think is it that sales teams understand the value proposition of what they're selling? And what strategies do you think can they employ to effectively communicate this value to potential customers and prospects?
So I can speak to automation as a space, right? Because software can be like applied for many different things.
Yeah.
I think in the case of automation software, I think value is central, right? Because at the end of the day, it revolves around making people more effective. And
Mm.
that translates very well to a value conversation. I think it's extremely important for salespeople to understand how to talk the right language around the product value and you know, contextualize it to the customer's particular scenario. Without it, they can't succeed. They will stop after the first few meetings. They may excite the lower managers, but as soon as the decision starts moving up to exec levels, it falls flat, right, or it gets delayed.
Right.
So absolutely critical. Um, the second part of your question, could you repeat that? Sorry, there was an interesting thought in there. You
Yeah,
mentioned
absolutely.
how critical is it for salespeople? Yeah,
Yeah, and how effectively what are sort of the strategies that you have seen? I mean, you talked earlier about that you're helping salespeople create playbooks, for example, right?
yeah,
So share a little bit the strategies that you can use to effectively for salespeople to effectively communicate that value proposition to potential
sure,
clients.
sure. I I think the big when we think about communicating value proposition, we typically think of this boardroom where you're making a presentation on the business case for a project, right?
Mm.
and
Yeah.
and I think that's really at the end of things where most of your stars should already be aligned.
Right.
I think the real meat of communication of the value proposition happens when people refuse to accept it, right?
Um,
um, and then you say, okay, tell me, how do you look at success? Let me work that into the business case. Does this assumption make sense to you? If not, why so? And this back and forth conversation, typically with the project owner or the champion, right?
mhm.
Iterating is the most important part of effectively communicating value, because they're gonna be the people who would be credible communicated internally.
Right.
And when you do this iterative business case building with them, like you can call it collaborative, you can call it iterative. Those are the cases where we find that the value proposition sticks, as
Mm.
opposed to, hey, tell me these 5 numbers about your business. I'll plug them into my business case template. I'll throw it over the fence and I'll ask you to set up a meeting with your boss, right?
Right. Right.
In many of those cases, we find the conviction around the value and the communications not effective, and deals will get stuck or fall off.
Right.
So yeah, I don't think there's like that. There's no secret sauce to the communication part as much as it about how you arrive at the number in the first place. If you do
Mm.
it the right way, then there's a much better chance that it would be understood well.
Right. 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 Very interesting. The so I know that you have experience both, both in selling in North America and in Europe. And I want to shift gears a little bit here. What do you think, in your opinion, are the differences? So in B2B selling in North America versus Europe, what, in your opinions, are the big differences for sellers and also on how buyers behave?
So let me start with the buyers, right? Because kind of sellers respond to that. My understanding, and Harry, to be absolutely frank, right? This is based on observing my sellers, right, in the
Right.
market. And my experience of selling personally is much more in India. So I can also speak to that culture and its difference. But I do have kind of fair amount of line of sight of what some of the differences are through the process. I think the number one difference that matters for our selling process is sort of the power distance within the organization. Typically, North America has typically higher power distance, and therefore, selling top down can work, and you can drive kind of alignment top down beyond a point. In Europe, with much lower power distance, you really need to work your way upwards well through the selling process, right? Uh, Sorry, I know you're wanting to respond to that, please. Yeah.
I was going to ask you a question for the sake of the audience. Explain the term power distance to the audience, please.
Oh, sure. In very simple terms, in North America, if your boss tells you to do something, you're more likely to do it. In Europe, if your boss tells you to do something, you're more likely to challenge it, right?
Right.
The perceived distance in power between myself as an employee and my manager or my superior tends to be less in Europe, where employees typically are more involved in decision making and generally have more leeway to challenge decisions coming top down. Versus North America, where the culture, again, these are generalizations. I don't know how widely they may apply. They would be industry nuances, but power distance is really about the perceived distance or difference in power between an employee and the manager, and
Right.
how it changes their behavior.
Right. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. So basically, the two differences are more than from a seller's point of view. You need in Europe, you need to weigh your work. You need to work your way up, shall I say? Whether in North America you can enter the sort of the hierarchy level higher than in Europe. Is that correct? What you're saying?
Absolutely, that's been one key observation about the difference in selling approaches that work. Um, Beside that, I think there's more, like, I would say, cultural nuance a little bit, in that just how pushy you can be for a meeting or for an alignment, or to ask somebody to introduce you to another person. I think my European colleagues, and how they work through their deals, they tend to be much more respectful in terms of asking or pushing for decisions, as opposed to in North America, where it's kind of seen as a much more positive trait among sellers, to sort of be a bit more blunt and pushy. Um, Again, these like more cultural. Beside that, Harry, of course, it's like more domain specific, but Europe is finally multitude of countries, legislation, cultures. So I think that's something that's easy to miss if you kind of broad brush it. And at every level, right from your product and the languages it supports, to understanding that in France, every invoice needs to be sent to a central authority which will distribute it, etc. Some of those nuances, knowing them matters, because I think if they get the feeling that you're trying to sell a one size fits all product to them, which isn't well tailored for their specific problems, then there seems to be much more rejection and resistance at the outset. So that's something our sellers need to adjust to a fair bit for Europe.
Absolutely. How about India? You mentioned, how does India play to that? So we talked about North America, we talked about Europe. Give us your opinion on selling in India and the difference to the two that we have discussed already.
I think my experience of selling to Indian organizations, I think a couple of things that do stand out. It can be very sophisticated buyers technology-wise, right? They're ready to leapfrog, because it's been the evolution of the country, right? So, for example, a change in an ERP is like a massive multi-year life-changing decision for many organizations.
Right.
I think at some level, the openness to make dramatic change and transformations I've seen is a bit higher. People don't react that negatively to the idea of large-scale change. Then another, from if I think of the same idea around power distance and how we sell, in India, a lot of businesses are owned by, they like have proprietors or founders. So, either private or public businesses. In those cases, it can almost effectively become an exercise of selling to that one individual who owns the business.
Right.
Like family-run businesses are really big in India as well. And this is true, I think, also in Southeast Asia and places like Indonesia.
Right.
Where there's some very large family-run conglomerates. So in those situations, just understanding the power dynamics and sort of the really top management layer and connecting to them becomes almost essential for survival. They can get extremely detail oriented in project details, economics, pricing, negotiation, etc. Highly involved and hands on. It can be very different from a typical corporate sort of behavior. So and then it's almost like personalizing your approach to the individual, which starts to matter. I think those couple of those would be kind of characteristics of the market, which might be a little unusual compared to North America and Europe.
Sure.
And finally, I think just the value sensitivity can be an extremely price sensitive market. That's something every company struggles with. So just getting pricing strategies right is probably super important.
Yeah. We're almost out of time. I want to ask you the last question that I always conclude every podcast with, which is, give us your opinion on that piece of the top 3 skills and behaviors that salespeople need to execute really well to make them top salespeople. We always talk about elite skill level for salespeople, and what are the top 3 skills and behaviors, in your opinion, that salespeople need to have and execute for them to be top sales professionals?
It's kind of my opinion across whatever decade and a half of seeing salespeople. I think the number 1 skill is the ability to listen instead of talking. People will tell you a lot. That's very important if you give them a chance to speak with just a few good questions. And I mean, of course, active listening. So paraphrasing, ensuring you understand and keeping the person comfortable. Because I think it's kind of fundamental to almost every step of the selling process, even knowing whether there's an opportunity there, where the value will come from, how the decision will get made, etc. That's number 1. I think the second, in my experience, is probably it's being and coming across as very well organized in terms of. Let me start with a couple of examples, right? The most successful sales conversation I personally had was when I sent pretty accurate minutes of meeting to a very senior leader in an insurance firm around 5 minutes after I finished the meeting, right? So, so being well organized in terms of kind of responding to whether it's a text, whether it's an email, following up diligently, and generally planning your activities very well so that you're extremely responsive, and that's seen to be diligent. I think makes a big difference in how people respond to you and how they open up to you. And probably the third one is being comfortable with uncomfortable situations. I think one big drawback to a sales personality can be to be over eager to please or accept what you're hearing. And there are a few crucial places where you need to disagree or really make a contrarian stand or show a mirror to the person in front of you. Really good salespeople aren't afraid of doing that, even though they know they might piss off some people in the room, right?
Right. And
cultivating that sort of detachment, emotional detachment from the individuals is also important. And I think that's one of the trickier ones for people who have intrinsically sales-oriented personalities to do well.
So, my dear listeners, you've heard it here first. Listening, being well organized and responding fast, and being comfortable with the uncomfortable are the 3 tips from Aditya Malik from the HighRadius group. So thank you. We really appreciate your insights. I know our listeners will very much do so. So thank you for your time, Aditya.
Thank you, Harry. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Absolutely. For our community of listeners, my dear people, 2 calls to action for you. Share this podcast with people that you think this would be applicable for, or that will be interested in the content of it. And the second one is go to globalperformancegroup.com. Join for free the Global Sales Portal, which you can access all webinars, all podcasts, all additional content, all around the topic of How do you sell and negotiate based on outcomes? How do you increase your win rates? How do you protect margins and reduce your sales cycle time? Until the next time, look after yourselves and happy selling to everybody. Bye-bye.